All right, let's get right into a really weird one. We're going to talk about an author from the 19th century, pretty much forgotten to time, who wrote a few books that, well, over 100 years later, they seem to predict modern American politics with downright spooky accuracy. This is the very strange story of Ingersoll Lockwood. And that, right there, is the big question we're tackling. Can a book written way back in the 1890s actually see into our future? Or is there something else, something stranger going on here? Before we even get into the story, just look at this. A fictional hero named Barron Trump. He's guided by a mentor everyone calls Don. And then, in a totally separate book, there's a cabinet member named Pence. I mean, come on. These are the parallels that made this thing go viral, and we are going to unpack every last one. So where did this even come from? For over 100 years, these books were just collecting dust, completely obscure. Then, in 2017, some users on a few internet forums dug them up, and from there, the story of Ingersoll Lockwood's prophecies just exploded across social media. Now, this collection we talk about is actually 3 different books. The first 2 are these wild children's fantasy adventures from 1889 and 1893. But that third one, from 1896, that one is something else entirely. And that, my friends, is where the story gets really weird. So let's start with those first 2 books. You gotta picture it. These are whimsical, over-the-top children's stories, totally a product of the Gilded Age. We're talking bizarre creatures and magical underground journeys. So the hero of these books has this ridiculously grand name, Wilhelm Heinrich Sebastian von Trump. He lives in a place called Castle Trump, but everybody just calls him Barron Trump. And yeah, that German-sounding heritage is just the first little coincidence that makes you go, And the weird details really start piling up from here. You've got this super rich, restless kid, Barron Trump. You've got this family motto that sounds familiar. And then there's his guide, this all-powerful mentor who sets the whole adventure in motion, a man known only as Don, who is described as the master of all masters. And here it is. This is the detail that took this whole thing from a funny little historical quirk and launched it into full-blown internet conspiracy theory territory. To start his journey to other worlds, Barron is told he has to travel to one very specific place on Earth, Russia. You know, the craziest part is that back in the day, these books were a total bust. One critic in 1891 wrote this scathing review saying the author tries so hard to be clever, but ultimately the sparks emit little light and no warmth. It's just amazing that a forgotten, poorly reviewed kids' book would become famous 130 years later for this. Okay, let's get to that third book, because this is where everything takes a hard left turn. A few years after his kids' books, Lockwood published 1900, or The Last President. And let me tell you, this is not a children's story. It is a dark, depressing political thriller. And you can just see the whiplash right here. We go from whimsical romps with strange creatures and fun puzzles to a grim story about total social collapse, angry mobs, and economic disaster. It's a completely different book for a completely different audience, but somehow it has the most jaw-dropping parallels of all. The plot of The Last President is basically this. A super wealthy populist outsider from New York City wins a shocking, deeply divisive presidential election, and it throws the entire country into absolute chaos. In the novel, riots just erupt. Mobs of anarchists and socialists are marching, and they're threatening the rich. And Lockwood is super specific about where all this chaos is going down, on 5th Avenue in New York City. And there's the kicker. That fictional scene of political chaos takes place on the exact same street that would, 120 years later, be the real-world location of the headquarters for a president-elect who fit the book's description. The geographical link is just uncanny. But this might be the one detail that just breaks your brain. The single most specific, most unbelievable connection in all 3 books. In the story, the new president's administration has a cabinet member with the last name Pence. A name that specific, in this story, that's what makes people feel like this has to be something more than a coincidence. So, what on earth is going on here? To understand the prophecy, you have to understand the man behind it. Who was this Ingersoll Lockwood guy? Was he a time traveler, a psychic? Or was he just a guy writing about the world he saw all around him? So we have to go back to Lockwood's world, the Gilded Age. From the outside, it looked like a time of amazing progress and enormous wealth. But underneath all that glitter, it was a time of intense social conflict, rampant political corruption, and a deep, nagging anxiety about the whole system collapsing.
I mean, these were the fears that kept people up at night back then. The fear that some populist leader would rile up the masses. The fear of economic collapse. The fear that the huge gap between the rich and the poor was about to tear the country in two. Lockwood wasn't writing about the future. He was writing a thriller based on the anxieties of his own time.
And that brings us to our final acts, where we put all the pieces on the table. Is this really a prophecy? Or is it more of a pattern, a trick of time, where the fears of one generation just happen to rhyme with the fears of another?
Let's go back to that very first table, the one that seemed so unbelievable. But now, let's add a third column, the historical explanation. And when you do that, well, the magic trick starts to make a whole lot of sense.
Let's just break it down. The names: Barron was basically a stand-in for robber baron, the super rich of the era. And Trump? A common German name, perfect for Gilded Age elites. The politics? He was pulling his plot straight from the headlines and fears of the 1890s. The location? Of course it was Fifth Avenue. That was already the symbol of wealth and power in America. What we're seeing isn't a prophecy, it's an echo. It's proof that while history may not repeat itself, its anxieties sure do. And that's pretty much the final verdict from historians and literary experts. They all agree the parallels are fascinating, maybe even one in a million. But in the end, they chalk it up to being a truly curious coincidence of American literature.
Which leaves us with one last, kind of chilling thought to chew on. Lockwood's books are basically a time capsule of the fears of the Gilded Age. So if our collective anxieties create these kinds of echoes through time, what stories are we telling right now? What are we writing today that 100 years from now, some future generation is going to dig up and call a prophecy?